First, I want to talk with you a bit about the supposed switch from a unipolar world, which is dominated by US hegemony, to a multipolar world where other governments, especially in the global south, are given more agency and more say in how the world is run. So lately, I've really kind of felt that the switch to a multipolar world has accelerated quite a bit, especially with the diplomatic gains China has made in the Middle East. So I was wondering if you believe that we're truly heading into a new multipolar paradigm. And I was also wondering what you think that might look like.
Well, the world is changing, and it's changing very fast from not just a unipolar world with the US role as a so-called hegemon, but really from a North Atlantic-led world of the last 2 centuries to a world where economy, finance, power is much more spread around the world. The industrial era began in England. It's therefore no real surprise that England or Britain became the first industrial global empire. And Britain ruled the seas and really ruled much of the world during the 19th century. And other European newly industrialized countries formed their own empires in Africa and in Asia. And that Western-led or North Atlantic-led world continued throughout the 20th century. But after two disastrous world wars and a Great Depression, the global leadership of the North Atlantic shifted from Western Europe and Britain to the United States. So the US has been the dominant power since 1945. But with independence of India, the end of empire across Africa, the restoration of real sovereignty of China, starting with the formation of the People's Republic in 1949, and with the economics that has followed that, the world economy has rebalanced. The spread of technology has become far more equal. China, of course, has become one of the lead economies and centers of innovation of the world. India is one of the fastest growing large economies of the world. The world's changing. And for me, a notable point is that the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, now, when measured at so-called international prices, have larger output than the G7 countries, than the United States, Canada, Britain, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. So that's a notable change. All of this means we're moving to a multipolar world. None of it means that the United States likes it or accepts it right now. So psychologically, the US is having a very hard time, and it's trying to hold on to its dominance. But that's just not possible in a world of diverse talents, skills, innovation, economy, when the US is just 4% of the world population.
Yeah, I get the feeling that a lot of people, especially in the West, have this idea that they might suffer under a multipolar order. Do you think that fear is warranted, or can the US and the collective West continue to succeed in a more multipolar world?
You know, as an economist, I'm a believer in a win-win world. I don't believe that globalization or the rise of China or the rise of India or the rise of Africa in any way diminishes the opportunities for well-being in the United States or Europe. Indeed, I think it enhances those possibilities. In any event, we need cooperation to face challenges like human-induced climate change. So, for all of those reasons, I believe in a win-win world where gains from trade and advances in economy from technological advances can and should spread around the world. If you are a military strategist or a geopolitical strategist, it seems that the feeling is quite different, that the gain of the other is somehow a loss for you. And so I know that international relations realists sometimes think that China's rise is detrimental to the United States. It's a different mindset. I think it's a dangerous mindset, actually, to think in that way, because it almost inevitably leads to confrontation and the real chance of deadly conflict. And so I want to emphasize the win-win nature of the world economy. It's not one region's gain necessarily at the expense of the other. Everybody can benefit from the advancement of know-how and technology and scientific understanding.
I'm really crossing my fingers. I too am really pushing for a win-win kind of situation. Now, the US and China have gone through obviously a really rough patch in terms of relations of late, with Nancy Pelosi's provocative trip to Taiwan last year, to Balloongate, to these allegations of widespread genocide against the Muslim minorities in Xinjiang, to calls for war by 2025, to the Select Committee on so-called competition with the CPC. And of course, lately, we also have TikTok and the mainstream media's kind of feverish obsession with Yellow Peril 2.0, kind of painting China as this dark, dangerous, dirty dystopia. Why is it, do you think, that the US is seemingly so obsessed with tearing China down at the present moment? And what do you think it would take for those relations to improve?
I think almost all of this is the result of China's success. The United States strategists and politicians didn't want a peer or a rival competitor, and then China showed up on the scenes as a large, successful economy that for 40 years plus, since 1980, has been one of the most dynamic parts of the world economy, and now at the cutting edge of many leading technologies. And I think the United States political class resents this, is fearful of it. The geostrategists who think in terms of zero-sum struggles think that China's advances to the detriment of the United States. Again, a mindset I don't believe and don't accept, and think is actually a very dangerous one. But most of this is a reaction to China's success. And I think that it needs to be overcome through systematic dialogue, negotiation, hammering out solutions where there are real differences, not the shouting, the finger pointing, the kind of hysteria. Of course, there's a lot of prejudice built in as well. You mentioned Yellow Peril 2.0. Well, there is some feeling wrong in the United States that if China has advanced, they must have cheated to do it. How could they be a competitor with us, after all? This is pretty ingrained and is wrong. I say to these people, get a passport, go take a visit, go learn something, read some history, understand the long sweep of history. I wrote a book in 2020 called The Ages of Globalization, in which China features for hundreds and hundreds of years as the world leading economy, the source of major technological advances. I explain the swings that happened afterwards, but I see China's recovering a natural position as one of the world leaders in innovation and technology. And from my point of view, that's all to the good. But this is not the mindset right now. And I think we have to work hard so that the mindset of fear and zero-sum thinking doesn't overwhelm us and doesn't lead to open conflict, which it could.
Now, speaking of having a passport and getting around, you've been to a few places. You've given economic advice to a number of governments, including those of Mikhail Gorbachev and Boris Yeltsin. And in Poland, you were awarded one of that country's highest honors, the Order of Merit, for authorizing a comprehensive plan to switch from a central planned model to the market economy. So I was wondering, based on your vast experience in that area, how you would summarize China's reform and opening up over the past 40 odd years. And do you agree with the idea that this country's witnessed kind of an economic miracle that's without precedent?
China has been the most successful, sustained 40-year economic development and growth of any large economy in history. What's happened in the period since 1980 is extraordinary and extraordinarily positive. China went from being a society with most people living in poverty. The numbers depend on definitions, but 60% poor, some estimate 80% poor, to ending poverty in its extreme form by 2020. Well, that's a phenomenal achievement. And it reflects a mixed economic system, both market and state, private and public, a tremendous capacity to plan at the National Development and Reform Commission, among other institutions, the tremendous capacity to build infrastructure, thousands and thousands of kilometers of fast intercity rail, of roads, of a power system, and so forth on a massive scale. And the Chinese economy lives on that physical infrastructure that connects the entire country. I've been watching this process closely since my first visit to China 42 years ago. So I came in 1981. China was very poor then. This was very clear just by looking at life as one would see it on the streets or in the shops. I've been visiting China frequently ever since 1981. And what has happened is absolutely extraordinary, hugely beneficial for China and beneficial for the whole world.
So do you think then that China has achieved anything specifically in their poverty alleviation process that maybe other states might be able to emulate?
Well, I say to my friends and governments in Africa that look at what China did over a 40-year period. Africa uses the date, interestingly, of 2063 as its reference point because 2063 will be the 100th anniversary of African unity and the foundation of the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, which is the precursor of the African Union. So they look to 2063. Here we are in 2023. Okay, 40 years. Think of China, 1980 to 2020. Think of Africa, 2023 to 2063. China provides an inspiration and, in many important ways, a kind of roadmap. Invest heavily, build infrastructure, get the kids in school, make the quality education, make the real investments that build the capacity of the economy. It's not gimmickry that brought China to its current prosperity. It is heavy investments, large scale, over a long period with good planning, good public administration, and educating generations of Chinese young people in skills, in scientific capacity, and so on. So I think there's a lot that is a roadmap for other regions.
Interesting. Now, to switch gears just a little bit, although kind of related, inflation has been a massive problem recently, but China's inflation rate is currently sitting at 1%, while the US is around 6% and the UK is about 10.4%, I think. In layman's terms, how is it that China is able to keep inflation so low, and do you think that rate will last?
Well, the inflation that is being experienced in the US and Europe is the result of dislocations that came from COVID and from the Ukraine war and from the sanctions that were imposed by the US and Europe in the wake of the war, and from the policy choices that were made in response to these shocks. especially in the year 2020 when the pandemic broke out. The central banks of the United States and Europe issued a lot of credit, a massive expansion of the money supply. And that turned into inflation by 2022. And the disruptions of the global supply chains, first from COVID itself, but then from the war and the geopolitical tensions with China and the sanctions regimes, when combined with the money expansion, boosted the inflation. China didn't do the same thing. China didn't make this massive monetary expansion in 2020 the way the Federal Reserve did. And China is not experiencing the same disruptions that came from the sanctions regimes, which have in some sense boomeranged on the sanctioning countries because it's disrupted their own supply chains. So I think this is partly the result of shocks and partly the result of policy choices, and I'd say some policy mistakes that were made in the West. There's no reason why this phenomenon has to be a global phenomenon in the same way.
Now, I kind of want to flip about 180 degrees. What do you think happened with Nord Stream?
Well, Nord Stream was a project that the United States opposed from its inception. Nord Stream is the gas pipeline from Russia to Western Europe, and the United States said from the very start that Europe should not buy gas from Russia. I disagree with that analysis, but the US said, well, that will make Europe dependent on Russia. To my mind, it's not a matter of dependency, it's a matter of economics and trade. Russia has a lot of inexpensive gas. Europe has a great manufacturing capacity. Buying that gas is good for Europe's competitiveness and for production. And that's where the pipeline idea came from. But the US hated the pipeline. The US said, well, this makes Europe follow Russia's geopolitics and so forth. I think that this was not the right approach. But it all leads me to believe that the most likely scenario of Nord Stream is the US blew it up because the US hated the project. The US warned that in the event of a Russian invasion, the pipeline would end. President Biden himself said that on tape on February 7th, 2022. And when the reporter asked, but Mr. President, that's an international project. How can you say it will end? He said, believe me, we have our ways. Well, I think we probably saw those ways with the destruction of the pipeline. It's not proved. The story that the investigative journalist Seymour Hersh has put out is very credible, and it has not been knocked down in any substantive way. And I had the opportunity to speak to the members of the UN Security Council and strongly urged an independent UN-led investigation. Let's get to the bottom of it. Countries know more than they're telling. We need to investigate. Well, China and Russia and Brazil said, yes, let's investigate. The United States said, no. Well, why do you say no? We need to find out. So I continue to urge the UN to investigate this because we need security of international infrastructure. And when a major pipeline is blown up, it's actually a global threat to the peace.
What do you think are the chances of the UN undertaking an investigation?
Well, I hope more and more countries support the idea of an independent investigation because there are many facts that need to be known, and because if we're going to succeed in fighting climate change, for example, we're going to need a lot of international infrastructure. We want it to be secure. We don't want it to be blown up. So when there is a major piece of infrastructure blown up, I say it's a threat to the peace in the sense that we need fiber, we need pipelines, we need power grids in submarine cables to make our world economy function properly. So we need security of the international infrastructure.
Do you think TikTok will be blocked in the US?
We're in a kind of mode of hysteria and panic and anti-China everything. So everything's possible. It's really, really discouraging to see our Congress waste time on this. And the anti-China feeling, has tried to destroy a lot of Chinese companies in recent years. Huawei, another one that was hard hit, but is finding its way around the U.S. Sanctions regime. So I don't know what's going to happen, but I hope that Congress calms down. I hope that all of the U.S. Geopolitics directed at China calms down. We need dialogue, discussion, negotiation. We don't need a ban on TikTok.
Okay, last question for today. Is the US a dying empire? And is all the provocation and calls for war and smearing and so on evidence of the last, desperate throes of US hegemony? And if so, how can we keep safe and avoid nuclear war?
Well, look, the U.S. is not and cannot be the global hegemon, meaning it can't be the country that runs the world. The US is 4% of the world. There's a lot of talent, creativity, and desire for sovereignty and for a say in world affairs all over the world. So the US is not the world hegemon, but it needs, at the political level, to get its head around that reality. To have a foreign policy not based on arrogance or illusion, but based on an interconnected world and the need for cooperation and peace. And I think it's possible to have that. The U.S. can be quite successful in such a world. What can't occur is the U.S. running the world. That's not going to happen. And if the U.S. persists in trying that, it's going to face more and more conflict around the world with other nations. So I think this is a question of the U.S. accepting the principle that we have a multipolar world and that we should make it work properly.